Hello, I'm working.
The light was on, but no sound. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. It's delightful to be here at the festival. Today, we're going to be talking about stories and Indigenous people. And we're all very lucky today to have with us one of Australia's foremost Indigenous writers, Julie Janson. Julie's written a couple of award-winning historical novels, Benevolence and Compassion, and also a highly acclaimed crime novel called Maduka, the River Serpent. So we've actually just spent the last 2 weeks together travelling around India.
With his family, not just together, right? I want to make that quite straight.
She's only saying that because her husband's here now. But yeah, we've had a grand time. I didn't really know Julie before, but we know each other pretty well now. We've been on the stage quite a bit together, so this will be a fairly informal event. We're going to talk about Indigenous writers that we like from Australia, and the importance that story has for Indigenous people in Australia. Julie, did you want to say something now, or should I ask you a question?
No, I'll say something. In the language of my father's people, the Darug language, I'm just going to give you a welcome. It's Kwaibidja Jamna Payala Dyanawi, which means we come together to sit and talk in peace. So welcome, and it's a great privilege to be here on our last session. So we're quite excited that the end is near, and we have to head back to Australia, which is terrible, really. We'd much rather stay here in India, I think. Anyway, Tony, do you want to ask something?
Okay, I'll just... in Australia, it was a little bit like India in the sense that not so long ago, if you said you studied Australian literature, the standard joke was, oh, I didn't realise there was any, so it was a while before Australian literature was sort of taken seriously, particularly in the academy. And then there's also been a really, I guess it took a long time for Indigenous writing to be also accepted. The first Aboriginal poet, well, not the first Aboriginal poet, the first one to make a name for herself and be published in English was a woman called Oodgeroo, or Kath Walker. And when her poems were first reviewed, they were pilloried. This is childlike writing, it's not real poetry. So it's kind of criticised on all sides. And then at no point did those critics stop and think, maybe I need to change, They kept wanting the literature to change to fit their idea of it. So I guess in my own experience as studying English in an Australian university, I was fortunate to come into a period of really a kind of renaissance, really, of Aboriginal writing. So Jack Davis and Sally Morgan and Oodgeroo, lots of great Aboriginal autobiography, Alice Nannup and all of these people. So there was a real efflorescence of Indigenous literature, and it was a serious area of study, and it has been ever since. But Julie, do you want to talk a little bit about you growing up and your Aboriginal experience, and then what it was like studying literature that tended to avoid your experience?
But just before I do that, I want to just pay homage to an Aboriginal press, publishers called Mugaballa. And Mugaballa actually have published the Compassion and Benevolence, and they'll also be working on my third one, which is going to be called Revelation, I think. But Mugaballa's been around for 40 years, and it is the only Aboriginal press in Australia. So it's been very important in lifting up new Aboriginal writers, but presses like University West Australian Press is also very much focused on Indigenous writers and Indigenous themes. But okay, now I'll bore you to death with my long story of my life. I grew up in Sydney on the Lane Cove River, and that's an important thing to me because my father, being a tall Indigenous man, just kind of assumed he was in the bush, and the bush is the forest, you know, the wild forest, which was along the river, but it's right in the heart of Sydney. It's now, that actual area, Boronia Park, is now part of a very, very salubrious suburb called Hunters Hill. But in my day, we were living in Housing Commission houses, which were houses built by the government for returned soldiers. Now, my father never identified as an Aboriginal man, so therefore he was entitled to get a loan to buy one of these houses. If he'd identified as an Aboriginal man, he wouldn't have been eligible. So he kind of kept this secret, and us children were told to keep quiet about who you were, and that way you could get on in society. I really regret that now for my dad. He died when I was 18, so that was a really unfortunate thing to him to have to do. We grew up pretty poor. Ours was the house in the street that had the old bomb cars out the front, and the couches inside had stuffing hanging out of them, and we were one of the poor families. But a lot of families in those days in that area were poor. But my mother, who was of English descent, very much believed that education could push you out of poverty. So she was very big on us learning as many new English words as possible. I mean, we spoke English, but we had a little book called our vocabulary book, and we had to get 20 new words for every Saturday, and we're 3 children, and the one who had most words got a chocolate. So we were very motivated to get that chocolate because it was really something quite special. But anyway, I'll skip forward. I ended up at University of New South Wales, on a teacher's college scholarship. I wanted to go to art school. I wanted to be an artist, and my mother said, no, you'll always be poor. You can't be an artist or an actress, both things I wanted to be. You know, you have to go and learn to be a teacher or a nurse, which were really the only fields available to women in the 1960s and 70s, really. So I became a teacher, and that has held me in good stead, and food on the table for 3 children for my whole life. But I started writing when I was about 7. I wrote poetry. I do know some of those poems, and I'm not going to inflict them on you. When my father died, I wrote one really long poem for him, and then afterwards my whole poetry feeling completely dried up. And I went on to write political theatre at university, and then work in Aboriginal communities and remote communities where I worked with Aboriginal people to write plays that would reflect their life. Yeah, big answer.
So when Aboriginal people started writing in English and performing, it's a period of the 1960s and 1970s, which was, I suppose, galvanised by political struggle. So there was a referendum in 1967 in Australia, in which Australia voted to recognise Aboriginal people in the census. Seems a rather small step, but it basically gave Aboriginal people rights of citizenship, which previously they didn't enjoy. As Julie intimated with her father, you had to deny your Aboriginality to be a citizen. You couldn't be both. That was how it worked. So the struggle took place in the 60s and the 70s, and the writers around that, they were writing poetry and plays. They were the main ones. Really, novel writing, there are examples of novels from that period, but very few. Novels really come in a bit later. So it's interesting, what do you think it was about plays and the particular role of like black theatre in Sydney? Do you want to talk a little bit about the importance of that?
Yeah. Well, just prior to this, Tony and I were talking about this, and often people from other countries, when they think of Aboriginal performance, they think of our ceremonial performances in traditional communities, the corroborees and the ceremonies that go on to renew the earth. They still go on today, and it's just as vibrant and alive in remote communities as they've always been. And there's been a great renewal too in urban areas for younger Aboriginal people to learn the songs and the stories in language and to dance and perform traditional ceremonies. But it's a recent renewal. But in remote communities, still goes on every day. If you don't do those ceremonies, then the rain won't come, the rivers won't fill, the great serpents won't rise. You know, they're important ceremonies in terms to looking after the earth. But what Tony is talking about here is there was an awakening of Aboriginal people who wanted to reflect the political environment, especially in the 1960s and 70s. And Oodgeroo Noonuccal, Kath Walker, was one of those people who was part of that movement for human rights for Aboriginal people that had been denied the rights to even to attend a mainstream school. And her generation, a lot of men and women had not been able to go to school and been taken from their families and put into institutions and had a very meagre education in order for them to become basically kind of slaves, unpaid workers. But in the late 1960s and the 1970s, there was a movement in Sydney called Black Theatre. And this was Aboriginal driven, and they were the people who'd formed organisations like an Aboriginal medical service, an Aboriginal legal service, and so they were quite prominent Aboriginal people working politically against the government organisations to try and force through the idea that Aboriginal people have a sovereignty and have a right to manage their own affairs. So very important political movement, which kind of matched the movement, the rise of black power in the United States. And part of that movement was the establishment of a theatre and also a dance company, which that dance company has gone on to perform all over the world, in London and New York, called Bangalore. And it began in Redfern in the 1970s. But a man called Bobby Merritt wrote a play called The Cake Man, which was set in an Aboriginal mission. A mission is a reserve set aside especially for Aboriginal people, especially on the outskirts of country towns. And a lot of those reserves are still there, but the focus and the legal status of them has often changed. Often that community is run by Aboriginal people, and they don't own the land, but they have the rights to live on it. Anyway, Bobby Merritt wrote this play called The Cake Man, and it was the first time audiences had seen what was going on inside a mission through the lives of some Aboriginal people and what they had to face. But it was a play kind of full of kind of love as well, and hilarity. And then later on, there was the famous Jack Davis from Perth in Noongar country. And Jack Davis revolutionised Aboriginal playwriting. Maybe you want to talk about him, Tony.
Well, his first play was actually for the sesquicentenary of my state. So 150 years after it was colonised, 1979, he put on a play called Kulak, and it featured a couple of people that are quite famous now, including a very young Ernie Dingo, who's a big Indigenous entertainer and personality and actor. But he started as an actor in Jack Davis's plays. And it was an interesting play because it had like the birth of the colony being kind of contrasted with a life of an Indigenous family. So as things were happening, you know, like they built a prison and you met Aboriginal people at the same time. So you got a kind of double staging. One was white people arriving in Western Australia and claiming it. And the other was Aboriginal culture absorbing these new strangers. And that was in the late 70s, that was a very radical way of proceeding. It was kind of a multimedia play which had murals and paintings. It had dancing and people played guitar and sung. So it was a very kind of wonderful kind of turning over of perhaps the purpose of this celebration, which was to really self-congratulate Australian settlers for all their great work in taking over Australia. So this play was really pushed back against that and in really fascinating ways. Julie, your first passion really coming out of university was in playwriting. And how did you approach that? Were you influenced by some of these people, or were you coming at it from a different angle altogether?
Like, I actually became a playwright purely by accident. I really wanted to be a visual artist, but I was a teacher in remote communities, and then I used to write plays with the students, which was extraordinarily good fun, making amazing costumes with great big masks and very theatrical performances, which kind of left the very traditional community with their mouths dropped open with kind of, because there were, in those days there weren't even any films or television or certainly not computers or anything like that. But I ended up with a job at the University of Sydney on an Aboriginal program called the Koori Centre. The word Koori means Aboriginal people in New South Wales. And I worked there with students who were often older than me, because most of them were women and men, a few men, who were training to be teachers, but they had missed out on basic education. So it was quite a long road for them to become a teaching assistant and then a teacher, and most of them didn't quite make it to being a teacher. But I worked with them in drama performances, and we would do a lot of improvisation, and we would use that improvisation then to write a play. And I wrote a play called Gungies, which means the police, and it was a play about a debutante ball and a death in custody. And that play is still performed occasionally over in West Australia at the Performing Arts Academy. So, yeah, that's how I began.
Also, with the plays, well, I'm conscious that the name of this session is the Storykeepers. That's an interesting concept, like it's not story sharers, it's not story sellers, it's not storytellers, it's story keepers. So, Julie, you've mentioned that you worked in remote Indigenous communities in the north of Australia. I think sometimes people think that, you know, when it comes to Indigenous stories, you could just take those stories and put them in your play. What would be the problem with doing something like that?
The problem would be infringing traditional Aboriginal people's copyright of their own stories, which is a much more serious thing than it is in a Western way. It's actually like stealing part of your soul if you take those stories. So it's a matter of, I don't do that, but there was one play that I wrote which was called The Eyes of Maregi, and it was a play about Aboriginal people in the north of Australia called the Yolngu people, who I used to live amongst for several years in Arnhem Land, and their traditional trade with Indonesia, from Makassar in Indonesia, which is Ujang Pandang. And that trade had been going on for 600 years. So the whole myth of somehow that the British discovered Australia, well, it had Aboriginal people in it for 70,000 years, and it had Indonesian traders in it coming back and forward across from Indonesia for since 1600. So I wrote a play about that, but set it in 1929. And in order to do the traditional story of that trading relationship with the Macassan people and the Yolngu people, I invited a very prominent and well-known Aboriginal dancer called Jakapura Munyarian, who was the man who kind of opened the Sydney Olympics with his dancing. And he came down to Sydney with a didgeridoo player, and he workshopped the play, and he was able to bring the songs and dances from his traditional community because his grandfather was Indonesian. His grandfather had been a Macassan fisherman. So with his permission, we were able to take that into the play. But it's because he was there to perform. We weren't borrowing that story, but he performed the traditional dances and the songs within the context of a Western play. So we ended up at the Sydney Opera House, so that was all right. Yeah.
In my own lifetime, really, in my career, I've seen the real change happening within Australia in the way that people regard stories. It used to be that novelists were given a kind of complete license. If they wanted to write about something, they could. That was what a novelist or a playwright or a writer was allowed to do. It was considered part of their creative privilege to take whatever they want and put it in. That's really changed in Australia and probably in other countries as well. But in lots of ways, I mean, partly it's just a general ethics of not speaking for the other. But I think in Australia it's also taken on this nuance where broader Australia has gradually become aware of the way in which Aboriginal people, they hold their knowledge responsibly. So each person has a responsibility to knowledge and a responsibility to story. And that's part of the way in which the community is woven together. So just grabbing bits and pieces is no longer considered to be right. And it's not just out of politeness. I think there is a genuine change now about people generally ask, like, okay, well, if I'm not the person to tell it, who would, and what's... So there's a whole process that people go through now, hopefully, and in many cases, of finding who owns a story and whether it's a kind of story that can be shared or can't be shared. And so that's been a really interesting development, I think.
And that especially goes with Aboriginal art too. The Indigenous art movement in Australia has become absolutely spectacular. I mean, there are from Central Australia, from Utopia or Amatara and various Anangu communities in Central Australia, Fitzroy Crossing, some extraordinary dot paintings. Some of you may have seen some of these wonderful paintings, and they've ended up now being, at the Louvre in Paris and in New York at the Museum of Modern Art, and extraordinary paintings which now kind of define what kind of Australian art can be at that level. And it's all Aboriginal art, and that's really only happened in the last 20 years. But it's and now that those paintings are proudly, there's even one, it's a ground painting proudly in front of Parliament House. And every year at the opening of Parliament in Australia, there's an Aboriginal ceremony, a smoking ceremony, where people are bathed in smoke, much like you would do in India here in ceremonies here, where a religious smoke cleanses the body. And that's in Parliament. So we've seen some extraordinary changes, and Australia's not quite the same racist white enclave that people tend to think it is.
I might go forward now to Julie's novels and the way that they tell stories, keep stories, involve stories. Each of your novels has had a kind of a process to them. If we might start with the historical novels, Julie. So Julie's writing her novels, historical novels, Benevolence and Compassion, in the early colonisation of Australia, so 1820s, 30s, 40s. Julie will give me the exact dates, but it's an early period where the colony's expanding out from its Sydney beachhead through different parts of New South Wales, and Julie writes sets a novel on that frontier, but foregrounding Aboriginal people's experience of that frontier. How did you go about researching that and understanding what it might have been like for Aboriginal people at this point in time?
And at this stage, to pay homage to Indian writers, so the subaltern of writing back against a dominant hegemony of colonialism, and Indian writers have been doing that for 25 years, and Adante Roy and Salman Rushdie, and writing back against that dominant kind of Raj kind of romanticism of that era. But so that kind of influence, I think, can't be underestimated with Australian Indigenous writers as well. But look, I just to segue from Tony talking about stories, I find when I write this historical fiction, at some stage in my story, and the protagonist is always female. I'm quite feminist about that. I have a lot of male characters that I celebrate. I love writing male characters. They sometimes try to take over the novel, and I've got to hit them back with a stick, because they're often, I write them so well that they seem to come to life and they want to dominate the entire novel. So anyway, but I keep, the women are foremost. But in each of the novels, there's a moment when an old lady appears in some way. And Tony will recognise this from the 3 novels that he's read. And an old lady will appear on the journey of my protagonists. They're picaresque novels, these novels that are the Compassion and Benevolence. They move across the country, and there's a Pakara. A Pakara is the female who fights against that kind of dominant English heritage, but she's really fighting from a position of having been brought up as a servant and often enslaved. So they're novels of escape and of winning. Too many novels in Australia depict Aboriginal women as victims, the one that is beaten up, the one that is killed, the one that is raped. And I was really determined to show that all the Aboriginal women I've ever met in my life and worked with, all the aunties and the sisters, they're all powerful, strong, resilient women. And so, I'm not going to be depicting any kind of misery, and they will win. And I always have an old lady who tells a story. And it's kind of based on the many privileged moments I had living in the Northern Territory and remote communities, when I would meet an elderly lady and I would sit with her and I would sort of say, Mother, can you tell me your story? Unfortunately, a lot of the time they were speaking in language and I would miss a lot of the story, but sometimes they spoke in a broken English, which we call Roper Creole is the language. And the stories were always very similar. They were really tragic stories about what happened to either their mothers or their grandmothers of Englishmen coming on horseback to these communities with maybe 20 men on horses with ammunition across their chests as though they're going off to some great foreign war. And tricking the Aboriginal men into cutting a great big pile of wood and then chaining the men up and shooting them all and burning them on the wood. And when the women ran away with their children, chasing the women down and killing them with the butt of a rifle because they didn't want to waste the bullets. Now, these are terrible stories, but again and again and again across Australia, they were the stories that we've heard. And it's in a way, it's like only sometimes the actual listening to those stories often comes from something like a European writer like Marr. What's his first name? David Marr, who's written a book called Killing for Country. And it actually forensically shows us all the different massacres and the names, as far as possible, of people who took part in them, who are often the grandparents or the great-grandparents of the people who own the land now. So these are quite revelations which are often quite shocking for Australians. Have I answered the question, or have I digressed?
No, that's fine. It helps us to understand. I think what you've illustrated there is something which is quite important in terms of this idea of story keeping. That's the theme of our session, which is that there's really two ways in which we know about the past in Australia. One is oral history, so what's been passed on by those old women. And one of the reasons things get retained by women in Indigenous communities is the men are often in jail. They're highly incarcerated in Australia, so women are often holding it all together outside, and stories proceeding matrilineally. So there's that archive, that oral archive, a kind of black archive, and then there's what we call the colonial archive, and that's all the inscriptions of settlers. So the letters they wrote, the diaries they kept, all the institutions like police kept records. English like keeping records. So there's records of institutions which also incarcerate Aboriginal children. So all of those things actually will be depicting Aboriginal people. They're depicting them as objects and as subjects of that are trying to be controlled or something like that. But there is a record there which slowly but surely Aboriginal people have reclaimed. They kind of reclaimed this colonial archive. Like, that was my uncle. What a disgusting way to talk about a human being, but that was my uncle, and that's my auntie, or that's my great auntie. So I know you're involved in this kind of work as well, Julie. Do you want to talk about how that came about in your writing career?
I was privileged enough to be employed by the University of Sydney, a professor called Professor Peter Reid, who writes about missing people. Like, for instance, he's written a book about the missing people of Chile who have been kidnapped and never returned to their families. So he started an organisation called Link Up to bring back, with an Aboriginal woman called Coral Edwards, to bring back the knowledge from all of those, what Tony's been talking about, all those government records, all those very carefully kept records in archives, and to find out the names of the people who were removed and link them up with the people who are looking for their missing brother or their sister or their mother or their auntie. And it's had a tremendous impact on families to have a family member come back to them. And a very famous singer in Australia called Archie Roach and his wife Ruby Hunter, they sing an amazing song, which is, about the return of children and what it meant to Aboriginal people to have those children coming home. They took the children away is the name of the song. You can look it up. It's a really important song in Australia and sung constantly in Aboriginal concerts and things. But those archives are very important. When I was doing my research for my books, I could barely find my family anywhere, and because they were generations after generation of servants, and they weren't famous, and they were often illiterate, and they often didn't have birth certificates or death certificates or marriage certificates. So it was like finding a needle in a haystack. And it took me about 20 or 30 years to actually finally find my family and who they were. And it was only through the smallest skerricks of information. But by working for the university at the time, I was able to go out and do research into communities all the way around Sydney to write a huge a website called the History of Aboriginal Sydney. It's still online, anyone can see it, .edu.au. And I was able to interview a lot of elders, very old Aboriginal people, and they told a story that in a way was kind of generic for my family story of what had happened. The men often were employed as woodcutters, cutting down the forests for all those trees that eventually went off to build British ships in the early days, and eventually to build Australia. And the destruction of those forests, and Aboriginal women nearly always worked as servants and were hardly ever paid and often very badly mistreated. But look, it sounds grim, but I actually, when I write, coming from a theatre background, basic theatre rule, make them laugh, make them cry. So in my books, I make you laugh and I make you cry. And Tony will attest to that. One old Aboriginal lady I know, I said, doesn't this material that you're working with, Deaths in Custody, doesn't it completely fill your nights with tears? She said, if we don't laugh and laugh a lot, we will cry all the time. So there's a tremendous humour amongst Aboriginal people, and it's a kind of a strange, funny humour, which is often a bit kind of mysterious to non-Aboriginal people. And Aboriginal women, their sense of humour is really, really naughty. And so we don't share it with the men and we don't share it with other women because it's really naughty. But I like to sometimes dive into it a bit and expose the reader to some of our senses of humour.
Yeah, it's definitely true. Julie's books are full of quite hilarious moments, actually. And they are quite dramatic. Julie, there was, through your research, you were able to find kind of ancestors, I suppose, and to what extent did you represent those ancestors, or at least versions of them, in your writing?
Yeah. Look, because I had so much information, I had so little information, I actually followed the matrilineal line down the 3 generations. 3 times great-grandmother, 2 times great-grandmother, and then great-grandmother. And I was able, there's a thing in Australia called Trove, and it's a wonderful website, and it has all of the newspapers ever printed in Australia for the last, 150 years. And you can put a name of a person and a date into that trove, and up will come anything that appears in certain newspapers. You have to choose the papers. So I chose the area where my family comes from, their traditional area out near Windsor, out along the Hawkesbury River, and I put in the name of a great-great-great-grandmother, Mary Thomas, and I put in a date, and bang, up came 3 incidences of her being in court, in a magistrate's court. And I thought, oh, well, that's curious, that's interesting. I just thought of her as a servant girl and having a nice, quiet life. And first time she was in court when she was about 16 years of age for stealing 9 fowls. That's 9 chickens, right? My husband used to write with his finger on one of my dowdy dresses, she stole 9 fowls, just to remind me where I came from. And the next time it came up, only a year later, in 1861, she was in court again for stealing some cows, stealing some cattle. Now, they're very valuable in 1860, and she got off the same as she did when she stole the fowls. And I thought, wow, she's pretty clever. And then the last one, she was in court for stealing a whole herd of horses. And I thought, what a woman! I want to know about her. And she got off again. She never, ever got put in prison. And I thought, how on earth did she ever escape? And I thought, she's got the gift of the gab. same as my dad had, can talk your way out of any situation. So that gave me the great enthusiasm to kind of recreate her around these true historical moments and try and understand how on earth she got away with this. And in some ways, you know, through my father's family and the grandparents that I knew, there was always some old uncle living in a shed in the backyard, and they say, that's Uncle Percy, you know, he was in jail for cattle duffing. He stole some cattle, and I'd think, it's come down through the ages, you know. We're very honest now, I might add.
Okay, well, speaking of crime, I thought we'd just spend the last few minutes talking about Julie's other genre, which is crime fiction. So Julie's novel, Maduka, River Servant, is, I keep saying serpent. I think it's the V in river that makes me say it. This is a novel which features an Aboriginal woman who is decided to become a detective. Do you want to tell us just very briefly about that novel?
We've got about 2 minutes? Whatever. 4 minutes. Okay, here we go. Auntie June is I decided I needed to write a novel where I had a mature Aboriginal woman in the centre. I'd always written about young women, and I looked in the mirror and I thought, hold on, something's happening here. You know, you've suddenly turned into this very mature woman. So I made Auntie June was a woman living in a country town who decided that she'd become a private investigator by studying online at a college, and it cost her $130. No, it was 130 hours and it cost $130. Anyway, something like that. And she got her Certificate 3 in Investigative Services, and she could get a private detective license. So she put a sign up on an old video store in town, you know, Investigative Services, confidentiality guaranteed. And all of her clients were Aboriginal women who were trying to track down their husbands who'd run off without paying any child support. And they couldn't afford to pay her, so they used to give her kangaroo legs with the fur still on them, and she'd put them in the fridge and the blood would drip onto the floor. Well, Auntie June ends up solving several murder cases, but the main thing that she does is she fights to save a river. So it's actually an ecological crime novel, and the great crime is the ecological destruction of a river by big business. And I could go on for hours about that. It's happening in Australia every single day. Yep.
And so one of the stories that's being kept there is the story of the river. So I think Julie once said in another talk that, well, maybe you should tell it, like, you found the name of this river serpent, and you thought you had been speaking to some elders, and you thought you'd ask them if that was the name.
Yeah. Well, when I in the research that I'd done along the Darling River, I found a name for the serpent in the river, because the name of the serpent changes all along the river, because Aboriginal Dreamtime stories, which are our traditional kind of stories, a bit like the Mahabharata. They travel along lines which we call song lines, and the song line is nearly always a river and a creek and a waterhole. And along that river, the name of the serpent would change. And then I found the name Maduka, and I thought, okay, that's an interesting name. And then I put it into the internet and looked it up, and there was a Maduka serpent in India, right? I'm not sure what area it was, but that a serpent called Maduka that was a sacred serpent. And I thought, heavens above, there's another connection, you know, with India. And so I called it Maduka, the river serpent, with the encouragement of the University of West Australian Press, I might add. It was called something much more boring before that. But the notion of that serpent that rises out of the water, especially when there's a flood, and comes up and actually speaks to Auntie June, right into her face one night in a dream, and its eye opens up and it looks at her, and she knows that she is being called by the spirit of the river to help to save that river, because that river had run dry, completely dry, because the water had been extracted by cotton farmers to take the water to grow their cotton. So the notion of those serpents living in rivers is a very important concept in Australia for Aboriginal people.
Okay. Well, I think we've reached the time. I'm not sure what it's like for you. We've probably just looked the same, but when I started talking to you, I could see all of your faces, and you've gradually become dark. So I realised that time has passed. We've gone from daytime to nighttime, and I've really enjoyed myself. It feels like I've been up here for hours. It's always like that when you're talking to Julie. So I wonder if we could just all thank Julie.
And I want to thank Tony, who's been an extraordinary person to travel with, and a writer and a very highly respected professor of literature in his own right. I want to also thank the Australian consulate here. I want to thank Harriet. I want to thank Steffi, and I want to thank Hilary McGeechee for making this possible. If the Australian government hadn't brought us here, we wouldn't be here, so thank you to them.